In April 2013, CNN, the Associated Press, FoxNews.com, and the Boston Globe all reported that an arrest had been made in the Boston Marathon bombing incident, a report that later turned out to be incorrect, a report that forced those agencies to apologize for their mistake. On December 12, 2012, multiple media outlets misidentified the shooter in the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre in Newtown, Connecticut. They also reported that the suspect's mother was killed at the school. This information turned out to be incorrect. An ABC News correspondent erroneously linked Aurora, Colorado shooter James Holmes to the Tea Party, and early reports about the January 2011 Tucson, Arizona shooting involving U.S. Representative Gabriel Giffords said the Congresswoman had been killed. Hello, I'm Chris Meyer. Welcome to Session 6 of Are We Being Deceived? Searching for Truth in Religion. With all of the sophisticated communications technology we have available today, how could television news reporting services get stories wrong? I'm sure there are a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the desire to be the first at getting the story on the air. Regardless of how the reporters got it wrong, the fact is that in spite of technology, in spite of the incident occurring at the time of the report, regardless of the fact that these reporters were interviewing people who they thought were eyewitnesses, they still got the story wrong. It happens. We're human, and humans make mistakes. In the last session, we examined the scriptures in the Koran and the Bible regarding the presumed character and nature of God, and compared those character traits to the criteria for truth. When we did, we discovered that there were contradictions. Because of these contradictions and inconsistencies, the scriptures do not satisfy the criteria for truth. Remember, truth is exact, precise, without contradiction. That does not mean that the Bible and the Quran do not contain the truth. It just shows that they are not without error. We'll discuss this more in depth in a later session. But how could this have happened? How could there be flaws in the scriptures? If the message from God is contained in these books and God is without flaw, then the message from this deity should also be without flaw. So what happened? People happened. As we've noted in the beginning of this session, there were mistakes made even in stories that were occurring at the time they were being reported. Why? What possible things can happen to a story from the time it occurs to the time it is retold? Well, maybe the person who's retelling the story gets the details from someone who really didn't have all the facts, or who didn't remember exactly how the story went. Maybe the story was somewhat dull, so the teller feels the need to spice it up a little, embellishing it to make it more dramatic or memorable. I think we've probably all experienced that at some time or other. Maybe we were the ones who did the modifying. Perhaps the story makes a good point or teaches an important lesson, so the teller modifies certain aspects of the story so that it more effectively fits the conditions or situations faced by the audience to whom the story is being told. Certainly we have hundreds of examples of that today, where authors will take old themes from ancient stories and put them in a more contemporary setting. This happens frequently in religious books, where a writer will take a biblical story and make it contemporary. How many people who read the book but are not familiar with the actual original story will retell the story using the contemporary version rather than the original story? Over hundreds of years of retelling, could the contemporary version actually become the traditional version? Now, let's imagine that there is no modern communications technology. In fact, no form of writing, except for perhaps a very primitive form of hieroglyphics or Sanskrit or cuneiform, that few people understand, so it is subject to misinterpretation. Let's further imagine that the most common form of communicating information is by word of mouth, storytelling. Is it possible that stories and other information, being carried over long distances by hundreds of different people over hundreds of years, all wanting to make the stories memorable, or more exciting, or more applicable to their audience, or changing it slightly so that it appears to support their particular agenda, is it possible that these stories might have been modified or enhanced or misrepresented intentionally or unintentionally? Given our own experiences, it is more than possible, it is probable. Even when explaining important events in history that we want to keep accurate, we tend to skew the facts to meet our own agendas or favor our political position at the time. The story of slavery will be told differently depending on the perspective of the teller. Likewise, the stories of current events taking place in various countries will be told differently depending on the political perspective of the person doing the reporting. This tendency has occurred throughout history. And given the lack of eyewitnesses, ancient stories are more likely to have been modified or enhanced or misrepresented than more recent stories where eyewitnesses are either still alive or were alive when the stories were written down or recorded in some way. Even in the case of religious writings, where the text was delivered directly to particular individuals from God or angels, humans were still involved in the transmission of those messages. In the case of the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch, the text was given presumably to Moses. According to some Bible scholars, Genesis was written by Moses around the mid to early 1400 BCE, and subsequent books of the Old Testament were written after that time until about 420 BCE. However, the earliest manuscripts that have been discovered date around the 3rd century BCE. So a lot of time passed between the origination of the stories and the actual writing. This is true with almost all religious documents. While the New Testament was presumably written within 100 years of Jesus' death, he didn't have any input into what was written. He wasn't able to check what was written down. The Gospels are filled with the sayings of Jesus, and yet only one of the Gospel writers, John, was an eyewitness that actually heard these teachings personally. And there is even some discussion as to whether or not that John actually wrote the Gospel. While the New Testament was probably written within the 1st and 2nd century CE, the actual canonized New Testament was compiled over several hundred years. The Koran was allegedly written by companions of Muhammad during his ministry, around 610 to 632 CE. But it was not actually compiled until 633 and standardized in 653 CE. So it's not difficult to see how these writings might have become modified. I haven't mentioned the Hindu sacred text, but the Vedas are the oldest sacred writings that have been discovered. The writers are unknown, but it's taught that the text was delivered directly to the writers by Brahma. You might be interested to know that I have found fewer inconsistencies in these writings than in any other sacred documents. I'm referring now to the Upanishads, the philosophical text that forms the basis of the Hindu religion. So this brings up 2 important questions. Isn't God powerful enough to protect and preserve the truth he once communicated to the world? And if the Bible and the Quran aren't completely accurate, then how can we determine what is from God and what is from man? We'll discuss these questions in an upcoming session. I'd like to remind you, if you'd like a little more detail, you can get my book, Are We Being Deceived? It's available at Amazon.com in ebook and paperback, or you can order it through your local bookstore. I hope to see you for the next session.